What's really going on in Cuba, and how does the Biden administration factor into the story? We're going to hear from a Cuban exile this week on Come On Now. Over the past week, we've seen an important story develop out of Cuba. Thousands of people, thousands of Cubans took to the streets to protest against their government. In the United States, we'll see a protest like this just about every day, and we think nothing of it unless it results in violence. In Cuba, the mere act of protesting is an act of courage. It's an act of bravery. Cuba has been ruled by communists for 62 years. Communism does not allow free speech. There is no Bill of Rights under communism. If you're not a member of the party, you have no human rights. The mere act of protesting can get you and your family thrown in prison. This happens in North Korea. This happens in China, and it has happened in Cuba, where there still may be thousands of political prisoners. Joining me this week on Come On Now is Mano DeAyala, the chairman of the Hispanic Leadership Alliance. Mano, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
So I didn't know this until very recently, but you and your family are Cuban exiles. You were not born in Cuba, but your parents were, and they escaped. Tell me a little bit about that.
Correct. So my parents, courted, dated, married. My two older brothers were born there. And then Castro came. And it wasn't long after Castro's arrival that they realized that their liberty, their property, all of these things were being taken away from them. And they, like so many other Cubans at the time, they fled to the U.S. And soon after, my father joined a group of Cuban patriots exiled here called the Brigade 2506, and this was the 1,400 people brigade that came in and executed on the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so that didn't work out so well for them. So he finally made his way back to the U.S. and soon after realized the United States was home and was going to call it home. He raised the five of us. I'm the youngest of five boys here, and it's been a blessing.
So just to recap a little bit, your father fought for Cuban freedom 60 some odd years ago at
Correct.
the Bay of Pigs.
60 years ago this year.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was 62 years ago that Castro, of course, took power and became a dictator over Cuba and has really ruined, I think, that country. I think it's fair to say, after 62 years of totalitarianism. We saw this uprising start over the week, this past week or so. How, in your opinion, did this get started? What are you hearing about it?
So I think that we have social media, we have the internet, and as much as the Cuban government tries to curtail some of that, they can't. And so you have this communication vehicle you didn't have before, and where there's enough people come out and say, hey, this is wrong. Let's get out in numbers. There's safety. Before the internet, there wasn't that kind of communication apparatus, and there wasn't that kind of safety. So people walked in fear. People spoke in fear. You'd hear stories about people whispering because they didn't want to be heard by their neighbors. It was a very bleak, and it still is, but a very bleak existence over there. Yeah, and if you compare it, Brian, if you compare it to pre-Castro, I mean, Cuba was just, and it had its problem. It had the Batista government that had its own problem. It had, cronyism and some corruption, and it had its own problems. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a thriving economy where there was a lot of opportunity and prosperity. Again, it had their problems, but those problems don't compare to the problems they've had post-Castro.
Right. I mean, I was actually just going to get into that because the Cuba of the 30s, 40s, and 50s before Castro, there's a lot of folks may not remember, but it was a playground. It was a beautiful island with a very thriving music scene and art scene, and you could not get better cigars in the world than those made in Cuba, and all of that is gone.
Right. So we had, think about it. Coca-Cola had its Caribbean headquarters there. GM. It was, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a 51st state in some respects, and that may be the wrong terminology, but it was very much a capitalist society. It was very much a thriving opportunistic society and a great place to live and raise your family.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, actually. I mean, you think back to those days and you had people like Desi Arnaz, who
Right.
became a big star in the United States. Born in Cuba, fully Cuban, became a big star here. Don't want to dwell on that too much. The protests have been going on now for about a week or a little more. Um, the Biden administration's response is coming under a lot of scrutiny. Uh, how do you assess it?
Well, I try to look at it in the context of history. So, back in the 60s, you had Republicans and Democrats both vilify, denounce communism, denounce authoritarianism. Uh, And now you hear this administration, they're silent. They won't blame the problems that are going on and have been going on in Cuba to its government structure, to basically communism and to that lack of freedom of the people. And that's exactly what's going on. And the fact that this administration is silent about that is scary. It tells you how they can't criticize a form of government that they're starting to embrace a little bit more. And it's, again, from my perspective, it's the silence is telling.
Yeah, we heard White House spokesperson Jen Psaki earlier this week or last week. She was quizzed about this by Peter Doocy of Fox News, and she couldn't denounce communism. No matter what she said, she talked about mismanagement, she talked about other issues. She didn't go head on and just say it's their form of government. That's the problem.
Right. It's not communism. It's just communism not done well.
Right.
Think about how that screams to this country just 90 miles away. So go back to the Bay of Pigs for just a minute. There were a number, and I've written a little bit about this, and there's a number of reasons why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. And I don't want to get into that too much, but one of the reasons was the Castro regime hadn't been there long for there to be this overwhelming disgust. But it's here and it's now. And this is the time. Kennedy said when the prisoners came back, about 1,100 prisoners came back from Cuba to Miami, he said, I think it was near Christmas in 1962, said, one day this flag, the Brigade 2506, that's what they were called, Brigade 2506. One day this flag will fly over Cuba, over a free Cuba. And when I saw what I saw on TV, and I saw the American flags flying in Havana, I thought to myself, today's that day. Today could be that day. If this administration has some leadership, this day should be that day. And you see it all over this country now. There are parades or demonstrations happening all over this country to support the Cuban Uprising. It's exciting.
It really is exciting. I think, you bring up the American flags that we've seen in the imagery, and I was stunned by that. I was working Sunday, and so I wrote the first story on PJ about this uprising and included the fact that they were marching with American flags. Any idea where they got a hold of American flags in a communist country that regularly denounces the United States?
Well, remember, just about everybody else in the world can travel freely to Cuba, and the U.S. has some limitations. So there's a lot of avenues for the American flag to get there. But what's telling about the American flag is if you listen to 50 plus years of propaganda from Castro, the Yankee imperialists, right? We're the bad people. Look at what the real people say.
Right.
We want to be more like you. We appreciate you, even though within our own country we have folks that don't appreciate us very much right now. But at least from the outside looking in, they appreciate the U.S. and they know that their ability to obtain some sort of a free society is going to depend on what we do. And I hope we step up to the challenge.
Yeah, these were young men for the most part carrying this flag. They look like they're in their 20s, carrying the American flag through the streets in Cuba. Honestly, I never thought I would see that ever in my life.
So remember, Castro, took power 62 years ago, like you said. And most of the people in Cuba don't have a memory of or weren't alive during a pre-Castro Cuba. So, it's not comparison that is driving this. It is outright despair.
Yeah, and it's not COVID like the media initially said on Sunday, and it's not an anti-government particularly motive that's driving this. It's anti-communism. It's anti-Castro that's driving this.
Correct. Absolutely, that's exactly what's happening, and you're seeing the repercussions of it in Cuba. You're hearing the stories of the police state cracking down on this and chilling it. And again, never will we have an event like this of a country that is right in our backyard, that is as pure of a communist country as there is, and you see the people rising, and we are supposed to be the liberators of those people, especially in our backyard. And we are supposed to be helping them. I don't see us helping them as a country. I think as a people, there are a lot of people trying to find ways to help them. But as a government, I don't see it. I hope it's happening. I'm optimistic it's happening, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, I think I'm not as optimistic. I'm going to read you a tweet that Dan Crenshaw released either within the last few days. And of course, he's one of our congressmen here from Texas. And he said, Joe Biden has an open door policy for illegal immigrants who wear his campaign shirts crossing our southern border. But he shuts the door on America-loving Cubans fleeing a communist regime and Afghans who risk their lives for U.S. troops. What do you think about that contrast?
Did you hear the rhetoric from the administration about Cubans don't come?
Yeah.
We will not accept you. Again, there is not a more dictionary perfect definition of the word asylum seeker than the Cuban refugee. That is exactly what we as a country accept as asylum seekers. And to compare that to what's happening at the border is telling. It's, again, I don't want to believe what I'm hearing, but I'm hearing it. So that's very disturbing to me.
Yeah, I think this policy is indefensible. I think that the argument they might make in support of it would be that it's dangerous to make the 90-mile trip across the ocean from Cuba to Florida. Therefore, don't try it because it's dangerous. But it's dangerous to walk across Mexico. It's dangerous to deal with cartels. It's dangerous to deal with the coyotes. And it's dangerous to deal with the drug situation, the fentanyl that's flooding across our border now. We don't have those problems coming from Cuba at all. We have an arduous journey across an ocean that we have the Navy to support if our administration chose to support it.
Right. If the rhetoric was it's dangerous, that'd be one thing. But that wasn't the message that was given. The message was, we won't accept you. And to me, again, in contrast to what's happening at the southern border, is telling. And people don't want to believe it, but we want to accept a certain immigrant, and we don't want to accept another. And the only difference between the two, other than their backgrounds and where they come from and the true oppression, asylum type events in their lives, other than that, it's statistically, how did they vote? And that's the only distinction I can come to between the two. And again, that's a country I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
I don't know that country. I've never seen that country before.
It's a country I don't recognize.
Right.
I don't recognize it. And I think in the past 6 months, this country has become a country that I barely recognize. But this policy in particular, I think, is one of the most startling and disgusting policies I've seen out of this administration.
I agree. But back to the Cubans, they're asking for help. They're not saying we all want to come to the United States. They want freedom in their country. They want their country. Again, that is a country that until my parents realized they were never going to be able to go back, that was their country. They made sure in raising us that this is our country. We are Americans. We are Americans first. And the country's blessed us tremendously. And that's why I think you see so many Cuban Americans so appreciative of this country, and defend this country the way they do.
Yeah. I see a parallel between Cuban Americans and Vietnamese Americans, who both have come to this country escaping communism. And when they come here, they become the most patriotic citizens we have. They become some of the strongest advocates for America that we have, and they thrive here. They come here with nothing and they thrive here, which says so much about this country, how you can come here with nothing and thrive and become wildly successful and lead a free life.
They have something to compare it to. And internally, the vast majority of Americans don't. And so it's easy to criticize in a vacuum. It's a lot more difficult to criticize by true comparison. And by true comparison, we are the greatest country that's ever been. And if as Americans we don't appreciate that and fight to keep it, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, and future generations too.
Right.
What can Americans who are not in the administration do, in your opinion, to help?
Well, I wish I could provide, we have certain things that we can do, humanitarian type endeavors that we can do to assist our friends in Cuba. But other than that, we're limited. Again, this is an action this speaks to a government assistance, a government intervention at some level. It's got to come from the government. Remember, unlike here, the Cubans don't have the right to free speech, right of assembly. So they're all criminals right now that are protesting. Of course, they don't have any rights to bear arms. They can't defend themselves or basically take any action on their own. But hopefully, the administration in Cuba sees this and starts to change from within. Is that possible? I'm not an expert. Hope so, but that may be Pollyannish. I think it's going to require a tremendous amount of nudging from outside of Cuba, and we have to lead in that respect.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the United States has to be the leader on this as the world's most powerful republic and the moral voice of free speech and the moral voice of the Bill of Rights and human rights. And we're the closest country to Cuba. I could be wrong. I could see this playing out a number of ways. I could see the government cracking down and crushing dissent like China did in 1989 and like the Soviets did in Hungary in different times. I could also see a different response from Cuba, a response that says we're going to allow freedom in the way that happened around the time of Boris Yeltsin when the Soviet Union dissolved, or an American intervention in some way or another. What do you think about any of those scenarios? How does this play out in your mind?
So a diplomatic solution is always the best solution, right? You want to be able to have that kind of a dialogue, that kind of a leadership role, and hopefully you won't have to do anything more than that, and whatever that is a pay grade that is beyond mine. However, you only have to look at, and I think I read this in a Thomas Sowell book, who said it was either the revenue or the net worth of the Cuban exiles that live in the U.S. is greater than the net worth of the country of Cuba. Now, if that doesn't tell you which system of government and which society is best for mankind, I don't know what else does. This is a land of opportunity. Cuba wants more of it. However we get there, I'd love to see it happen in my lifetime. And I'd love to see it happen, now. Because right now is the opportunity. Right now is when you see the people rising and wanting it the most. The world is watching. What are we going to do?
I think that's the perfect place to end it. Mano DeAyala from the Hispanic Leadership Alliance, chairman of that group, and Cuban exile. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.